maybe 3 almost now.
So what does a senator do after a long contentious session? Is it the golf course? Is it the backyard?
It's been Zoom meetings and kind of a continuation. I had a Labor and Commerce Committee meeting this morning for 2 hours and working on some transportation issues in the Yakima Valley before that. So it's just, you focus on different things. They call this a part-time job, but I'm not sure where the part comes in yet, but
Doesn't end.
Can't complain, just keeps going, but that's all part of it. So,
Yeah.
And Betty, it's good to see you.
Yes, it's good to see you also. Yeah.
So we'll see how everything is going. I'm curious to get caught up a little bit. So
Yes.
Rob Watman from ODOT just arrived. Mayor McBride just arrived. Miles Pengley from Thorn Run Partners just arrived. Steve Siegel just chimed in. I think as soon as we get Marla, Mayor Keithler, we can start. I believe Commissioner Benton from Hood River County will not be joining us. So Commissioner Babbitts, his alternate, will be in the role as the primary member.
So I don't think Marla's going to be able to join us today.
Oh, okay.
I thought she'd let you know that.
Okay, I don't recall that. But okay, well, that's good. That's good to know. So let's see here. I think we have everyone. I don't know if Brad Boswell may join in as well a little bit later. So welcome everybody. Thank you for making time this afternoon. Just as we look at the agenda, just two clarifications. After the legislative update, I'll go ahead and give an overall arching project update, as I heard Senator King and others may be interested in hearing a more thorough update. And then, okay, here's Brad Boswell coming in. And then at the end of the meeting, before we adjourn, I was thinking if there's time, it might be nice for us to come up with a standing date and time for us to meet. I think it's fine. I don't mind sending out the doodle polls and so forth, but we're meeting so frequently that we spend so much time scheduling that it might make more sense just to get something permanently on the calendar. So if that sounds okay, why don't we start with our star of the hour, and that would be Senator Curtis King from the Washington Legislature. Senator King, welcome, and just a wonderful thank you to you and everyone in the Senate Transportation Committee in everything that you've done this session. So why don't you take it away and let us know what you were up to this session.
Well, I'd take up the rest of your meeting if you wanted me to on that note, but it was a very interesting session in that it was mainly a virtual session. We did have, several members consistently on the floor, kind of running the show, but there were lots of things passed that, in my opinion, probably shouldn't have been, but that's a whole different story. I think the interesting part about the whole session, just the session itself, was the virtual, doing everything virtually or predominantly virtually, I think led to a lot of the outcomes that we had. There's a world of difference when your main group of people that you are listening to are the same group of people that are in your caucus or on your side of the aisle. And that's who you mainly deal with and talk with. And you're not sitting across the table or in a committee room where you can see each other and have to look each other in the eye and say, hey, I can't go there, I can't support that. Or saying, I don't care whether you like it or not, we're going to pass this thing anyway. And I think that's the one, I think, negative about the virtuality of this session. It just wasn't enough give and take, and actually having to look at each other and have that continual contact. That all being said, we did get some good things done. We did pass a budget. It was a very kind of bare bones budget because we didn't have a lot of money, to say the least. But from the Hood River standpoint, I think 2 years ago or a year ago, we were able to get $5 million moved out to 2030 as it was, as a placeholder on another project that was within the district, at the request of the two chairs, by the way, because they didn't want to show a new project. So, sometimes you feel like, well, that's a good thing. Sometimes you feel like, well, maybe they're just setting me up. But you have to have a good relationship, and you have to trust the people that are running those particular committees. And as we got down to it, there was a lot of give and take from the House versus the Senate version of the budget. But we were able to keep that 5 million in there and actually bring it out and send it to Klickitat County to be able to use for, I guess, phase 2 or the next steps on the Hood River Bridge. And so that was one of the highlights of this session. As we all want, as you folks know, by example, you're working awfully hard on trying to keep this project moving forward, address each step as it comes along. And so I'm hoping that 5 million will help keep this project going. I will close by saying we anticipated that when we got through with session, that there would be a real push for a transportation package. And there was a package presented by Representative Fye in the House and a package representative by my chair, Steve Hobbs, in the Senate, both Democrats. Some similarities, but a lot of differences on how they approached the funding and where that funding came from and then how it was spent. But neither one of them went anywhere. And there was talk right after session that, within 3 weeks or 4, that they would be getting together, drafting a negotiation schedule, and then coming up with a transportation package that we would then be called back into special session, and there would be a vote taken on that package. As things have twisted and turned, I think of those soap operas. That's kind of what this is like. As the world turns, a lot of things have changed, and it appears there's going to be a federal package for infrastructure. And that being the case, I think they have decided that they're just going to wait for a while and see what that infrastructure might be. They feel comfortable that it's going to come at some point soon, and see what that might bring to Washington, and then they can adjust their packages accordingly. That all being said, we now hear that there's more concern about just bringing the legislature back for any kind of a vote, particularly a vote that's going to include a large amount of taxation, be it an increase in our gas tax or a variety of other things. So at this point, things are still up in the air. I would say if I was going to place my money on whether we're going to have a package this year or not, my guess would be no. But again, we've been out less than a month, and all of that has transpired since we adjourned. So you just never know, but that seems to be the case. And so I'll quit at that, be willing to answer anybody's questions, but I'm looking forward to getting your update on where things are at with the bridge and what our next steps are. And speaking of that package, whenever it shows up, we have already tried to lay the foundation that there needs to be at least $150 million in there for what we're calling the Hood River Bridge. So we'll just see how that all plays. And we have lots of needs in Transpo, and I think both of our states do. So anyway, thanks for the opportunity to be with you today, and I look forward to your update, Kevin.
Well, thank you, Senator. I mean, on behalf of the Bi-State Working Group, just wow. I'm just so impressed with the work that you and Brad Boswell on our lobbying team have pulled off. This was, we're just very fortunate that you're in our district and that you knew the way to maneuver through the Olympia politics. And so thank you. With that, I'll open it up if there's any questions. I mean, I have a couple of questions that I'll hold off until the end, but any other comments or questions by the members of the group? Applause is okay too.
Yeah, no real question, but lots of applause.
Not necessary, not necessary.
Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate all your work on this.
Well, thank you. It's a good project. That's the difference there.
Senator King, with the 150 million for the construction, if we don't do it this summer, which doesn't seem likely, that gives us more time to use the 5 million to get more design done. So if we hit 30% design, is that talking like the perfect storm coming together where then it looks like the 150 is viable, we're getting closer on cost estimates?
Yeah, I think any of that would help. My concern now is whether that 150 is going to be enough, because what we're seeing is shortages everywhere, shortages in steel, and you name it. I mean, I drove by the place where I bought my last car, and they hardly had any new cars on the lot because they can't get them. And then try to find a used car. That's probably just as hard. I looked at our little Realty magazine, Realty magazine that we get in the paper. There were more realtors listed in that magazine than there were properties for sale. I mean, it's a crazy time right now, and I think our challenge is, we've all been locked down. We've all cut back. All of our businesses have kind of put the screws down, and they're being very cautious. And that includes our manufacturers and those that produce the things that we need. And now they got to crank back up. But the demand is there immediately. And so there's going to be this 6 months, 8 months, a year where I think we got to fill back up all of the things that we have kind of depleted as far as inventory goes. But all that means is the cost of everything has gone up. And so we have to recognize that fact and then adjust accordingly. But to your point, if you can get to 30% design, all of that helps, keep the project viable and makes it easier for us to justify why we need it in this new package that's going to be coming out with any luck. So, and while I'm flapping my gums here, I also want to say, and I don't say it just because he's on the line, but it's the truth. Part of the reason that you got that 5 million has to do with Brad Boswell as well. You are very well represented in the legislature by Brad. He does a great job and has good relationships with almost everybody in the legislature, including particularly those in transportation.
Senator King, can you touch base, or Brad, whoever's best suited, to talk about the $50,000 for the governance work, for the long-term creation of a bridge authority? There was, I believe, a small amount.
Yeah, we had worked with again with my chair and then with Representative Fye, again the chair in the House, in regards to a study to come back with what are the elements that are needed if you were looking at a bridge authority to help run and maintain this bridge. And so that's we worked with we have a joint transportation committee in our legislature, and so they have been chosen, and we talked with them and about what we were trying to accomplish, and with Brad's help kind of defined that so people understood what we were looking for. So as you form a bridge authority, what are the elements that you want that authority to be able to do, and what kind of elements do you need in order to establish that authority? And so that's what this study is going to do, and hopefully when we get that result, which I think we'll get this year, we can combine that with whatever Oregon is doing and see if we can't meld the two together and come up with an authority, and then get both of those approved through the legislature. That's the theory anyway.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Senator King, when Jacob and Marla and I spoke with you, one of the things you were discussing was the PP, public-private partnerships.
Yeah.
And you gave us feedback on that. And I think it would be good for the group to hear it directly from you, what you were trying to tell us.
Okay. Okay. Well, public-private partnerships in the Washington legislature aren't, at this point in time, I would say, looked upon with a lot of or not looked upon with a lot of favor. The former speaker over in the House does not like public-private partnerships, and I honestly believe it'd be a real tough sell if that was the route that was chosen for this bridge, just because of that element. Not just him, but there's a variety of concerns, and I think we'd be better suited to go down a design build or a bid build, whatever it would be a better way of approaching this bridge and keeping that momentum going, rather than having I don't want to call it a fight, but a justification of why a PPP would be good on this project. Does that kind of relay the message that I tried to relay to you earlier this year?
That's exactly how I understood it as well.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions or comments for Senator King? Okay, well, hearing none. So we do have Miles Pengele from Thorn Run Partners, and he is our government affairs representative in Salem. And so Miles, do you want to give the working group an update on the $5 million contribution from the Oregon side, and then maybe just touch base on the post-session plans for the governance?
Yeah, absolutely. So I obviously do not have news that's quite as good as the fact that the money is signed, sealed, and delivered from Oregon, the way it is in Washington. Oregon's legislative session does not end until June 27th, or at least that's the constitutional deadline. It might end slightly before that, but we have a solid month probably left. The revenue forecast, the June revenue forecast, will be delivered this afternoon, which will provide the most complete and reliable picture of the state's resources and finances. That will be the foundation that the Ways and Means co-chairs and legislative leadership will be using to make decisions about the budget. Including telling us how revenue from the Oregon lottery is doing and how much bonding capacity the legislature has for lottery bonds. Lottery bonds are the funding route that we are almost certainly likely to go to get funding for the Hood River Bridge project. Those funds are usually used for capital projects, particularly for public entities. And so currently our project is sitting in the Ways and Means Capital Construction Subcommittee, which considers a number of capital investments, including lottery bonding projects. Commissioner Benton was kind enough to testify on behalf of the Hood River Bridge project when the lottery bonding bill had its hearing on May 7th. So we really appreciate him doing that, and having a member of the bi-state bridge, or of the bi-state working group representing the project, I think was really positive at that hearing. Kevin and I continue to do meetings with all of the decision makers who may be involved in whether this project gets funded. We have made our way through all the members of the Joint Transportation Committee, most of the members of the Capital Construction Subcommittee, and now we are moving on to meet with the other members of the full Ways and Means Committee, whom we haven't met with yet. After the hearing that occurred in the Ways and Means Capital Construction Subcommittee, they will decide which projects are going to be selected for lottery bonding, and then that bill will be moved through the full Ways and Means Committee for passage. We will probably not know whether the Hood River Bridge project was selected until just about the end of the session, when that end of session bonding bill is released. But I think we're in really good shape. I don't think I reported this to you, but we were able to secure a half an hour informational hearing in the Joint Transportation Committee so that Michael and Kevin and Commissioner Everett could present on the project. The very fact that we were able to get that much time in a busy session to talk about the project and the need for the project and the port's progress there is a really good sign that is of interest to the legislature. We got several unsolicited positive comments from both Democrats and Republicans on the Joint Transportation Committee during that presentation about the support for the project. I think that a lot of the legislators in more rural areas of the state that use I-84 as their main east-west thoroughfare understand and appreciate the regional significance of this piece of infrastructure, and understand how in need it is of replacement. And so, I think we are in a good place. We've met with virtually all the members of leadership and decision makers in the legislature, who will be determining whether or not this project gets funding. I would say that the response to the project has been very, very positive overall. And so looking ahead, I think we'll have a clearer picture of the state's revenues and available lottery revenues after today. Our firm will be sending a report on the revenue forecast to the Port of Hood River. Kevin and Michael certainly can share that with you if you are interested to see that. The other dynamic that is still at play, which I think we are hopeful is positive, obviously the state of Oregon, as well as all the other states, got a large amount of funding through the American Rescue Plan Act from the federal government. One of the explicitly allowable uses of those funds are investments in broadband infrastructure. So general infrastructure like a bridge is not an allowable use, but water and broadband infrastructure are. The state was planning to spend a good deal of its lottery bond revenue on investments in broadband infrastructure. So we are hopeful that that funding can now be, or that infrastructure can now be funded with those federal ARPA dollars, which will free up more lottery bond dollars for other infrastructure projects such as the Hood River Bridge. So again, we will have a clearer sense of where the financial picture is today. But in terms of our progress lobbying the project, I think we're right on track. And we will be making a final push here in cooperation with Senator Thompson and Representative Williams, who are championing the project to make sure that it gets across the finish line and is included on that lottery bonding list as the session wraps up. Any questions about where we are on the funding before I move into the governance piece? Okay, so things work a little differently in Oregon as far as the drafting of the legislation. It's great to see that there's some dedicated funding and dedicated staff who are going to be working on Washington legislation to stand up the Bi-State Bridge Compact. In Oregon, what we'll be doing is pursuing a bill that will be drafted probably. The actual 2022 bill can't be drafted until after the session ends at the end of June. One thing that we've discussed and we're going to look into is whether if Senator Thompson or Representative Williams have any priority bills left. It's too late in the session to draft legislation unless a legislator has a priority bill. If they have a priority bill that's unused and we have enough information about what we would like the Bi-State Bridge Authority to look like, we could get a bill drafted just so we have a starting point and a discussion point to bring to legislators and start talking about in the waning weeks of the 2021 session. But the actual vehicle will be drafted by Legislative Council. I think the earliest we'll be able to get that started is in July. And I think our goal is that in addition to having the sponsorship of Senator Thompson and Representative Williams, it would be great to have that bill submitted as a committee bill, which sort of, it would probably come from the Joint Transportation Committee, and it would be a statement saying, you know, this is a priority for the Joint Transportation Committee. This is something that we want to see passed in 2022. So we're willing to get this bill drafted as a committee bill instead of being sponsored by an individual legislator. So that's probably the route that we'll pursue. We'll be doing meetings here over the next month to see if we can get that set up and ready to go. And then this is a strange turn of phrase, but that's how they refer to it, at least in Oregon. We will seek a note from mother, which means that a legislator or a member of the committee is giving us permission to work directly with Legislative Council, who's in charge of drafting the legislation. We can talk about, you know, who the right parties would be to have that direct contact with the drafter, so that Steve and the other folks who are working on the Washington legislation can be in direct communication with Legislative Council in Oregon and ensure that the bill that's being drafted in Oregon is mirroring and aligning the legislation that's being worked on in Washington. So that we will be starting that work in summer, probably July of this year, and then continuing to work in cooperation towards a bill that's ready to be finalized and submitted to the legislature in the fall.
Any questions from Miles?
No question. It's just encouraging to hear that you're already thinking in terms of mirroring and aligning the two efforts.
Well, you know, we won't have a lot of time really between the sort of the end of the Oregon session and when bills need to be submitted in Oregon, and I think in Washington too in the fall. So we certainly want to make sure that we're all on the same page from day one in terms of those bills meshing with each other.
And it's great that Steve is here. Obviously, he's got a presentation a bit later, but Steve did meet with the Joint Transportation Committee in Olympia a couple of months ago with Brad and myself. And so Steve is definitely keeping abreast of the activity as he tries to iron out any differences between Oregon and Washington state rules and regulations. Thank you, Miles. I don't believe there are any more questions. Hearing none, I'll go ahead and just give a brief update. I think you've got a good summary on the legislative side. Just a brief summary on the federal efforts. The FAST Act reauthorization, we were looking for a $5 million contribution from Representative Bentz. The Klickitat County side teed up a similar request to Representative Herrera Butler. And we learned, unfortunately, that Representative Bentz just decided not to submit any projects forward, but that from the last I had heard, Representative Herrera Butler is continuing to submit that request. I don't know if anybody on the Washington side has anything more on that, but that's where we're at on the FAST Act reauthorization. As noted, Senator King did note that the Washington legislative appropriation will be coming through Klickitat County. I did have a conversation with Commissioner Anderson yesterday about beginning the process of developing either a interlocal agreement or intergovernmental agreement between Klickitat County and Hood River, the Port of Hood River, so that the work that's laid out in the memo of understanding can continue on. So that work will be happening as we await for the actual Washington state appropriation to be released to the county. And I'm sure there will be lots of strings attached to that funding as well. Staff is for the Port of Hood River is updating the bridge replacement project director job description. My current description is focused on NEPA and is currently being updated to reflect the pre-construction tasks and the governance work that will be prominent as we enter phase 2. One of the elements that that staff is working on is developing an owner's representation project advising contract. So through the NEPA process, we had a contract with OTAC to provide technical expertise on the NEPA process. Likewise, even though the project is obviously going to have an engineering team on board, it's our recommendation that there be an owner's representation contract separate from the engineering firm that can represent the bi-state working group's interests and just be a third-party peer review of the activity that the engineering firm would be doing. In addition, that owner's rep contract would help with some of the project management, teeing up the order of work and providing advice to the bi-state working group in the port in Klickitat County and others about the order of work and how it could be implemented. I think we've touched base on the government affairs work. A big thank you to Hood River County Commissioner Bob Benton, who testified in front of the Ways and Means Committee. He actually got on this time. If you recall, the last time we struck out, there were so many people and not enough time. And then I did want to give a call out to White Salmon Mayor Marla Keithler. She did serve on the Washington Council on International Trade, a panel to discuss rural infrastructure projects. And she used the bridge project as her case study for that conference. And so the WCIT, just for background, is a state organization advocating for trade and investment policies, just to increase competitiveness for small and medium-sized businesses. So thank you to Mayor Keithler for thinking of the project. On the NEPA process, both the archaeological and historic structure technical reports, commonly known as Section 106, are complete, and those are being distributed for agency review. Consulting parties will then be meeting in June to discuss possible mitigation or avoidance solutions in later that month. Obviously, the biggest impact is going to be to the existing bridge. And so coming up with ways to commemorate the loss of that historic structure will be a primary point in that discussion. The port is undergoing its review of the land use chapter. The Port of Hood River property is really the most impacted by the replacement bridge. And so the port is certainly concerned about how the new bridge would impact not just port property, but port operations. And so we are going through a review, a third or fourth review, to make sure that the impacts to the port are adequately represented in the final EIS. The biological opinion covering the Endangered Species Act, we are waiting for the National Marine Fisheries opinion, and so that is still pending, waiting for that to come through. Had a wonderful meeting this morning with the Yakima Nation Fisheries management team, and really talked about ways that the piers of the new bridge could potentially be built with something as simple as like eye hooks or hooks, so that fishers would more easily be able to hook up their nets to the piers. So very simple solutions to those traditional fishing rights. I don't know if you know this or not, but the fishers do actually tie their nets to the existing bridge. And so the fact that we are having these types of conversations 3 or 4 years in advance of needing to start mobilizing bodes well for developing the relationship with those tribes. There will be follow-up discussions with the project team and the Yakima Cultural Resource Committee, and actually their governing board as well, as the replacement bridge will need an aerial easement over the underwater portion of that treaty fishing access site. And so by getting in early, finding out ways that we can benefit what they're doing, we're just hoping to really get a good partnership as we move forward working with the tribes. Obviously, Steve will be presenting on the finance plan, and then we're going to finish off the meeting today with reviewing the strategy principles that we discussed last month. Did receive the build template from Federal Highways. We do have a meeting with Federal Highways for this Friday. That will also include members of ODOT and WashDOT, as money is going to start coming from a whole number of different resources, and we all need to be on the same page about how the procurement's going to occur, regardless of whether the money is coming from Olympia, Salem, or Washington, D.C. So we really want to make sure there's a good, healthy understanding on how we're going to proceed with that mixture of funding. There's about $600,000 left with the House Bill 2017 funding. So obviously we want to transition through House Bill 2017 into either the Washington appropriation and or the build money. And then I don't believe Steve will talk specifically about this, maybe he will, but he has reached out with the U.S. Department of Transportation, the TIFIA program, which will ultimately be a primary loaning agency for the remaining balance of the project. And so making sure that we've got good outreach and coordination with our federal programs is equally important. So that is kind of the broad, high level review on the balance of the program. If there's any questions on NEPA or any of the other elements, I'd be more than happy to answer those.
Kevin, I just have one question. There'll be another contract with a firm, an entity, or a person to kind of oversee the engineering and those things that are going to go on, you mentioned. Will that be someone that has specific engineering expertise, or will it be more project management expertise? I mean, I was thinking of the people that we had that kind of had more overall management expertise when we had the P3 people.
Yeah.
Would it be somebody like that? Not the P3 people. I just mean this other these other people that we spoke with. Is that the kind of person or a firm?
Exactly. It would be
Okay.
a firm that had extensive background in project management, but also had engineering expertise in their firm as well. So they could provide some independent oversight, not doing deep dive on the engineering contract, but just there to ask and review submittals when need be on behalf of the project. But project management is going to be the big one.
Kevin, this is Curtis. I have to run, but before I left, I wanted to say thank you for the update. And I want to thank everyone that's on this Zoom call to say thank you for all your efforts. It is just, it's marvelous to see the Oregon side and the Washington side continue to work together, because that's what's going to make this project go. And thank you all for your efforts, your time, and your commitment. And we will have further discussion. And if there's anything that I can do to help, I hope you'll give me that opportunity. And thank you for the opportunity today. So.
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Senator.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right. Went a little bit longer than what I had on the agenda, but I think that was a very worthwhile update, especially from Senator King. Any other questions before we transition into the finance plan discussion with Steve? Okay, did you have any follow-up on the question on the owner's rep contract?
No, I think you cleared up what that is. Is that, is there an RFP being developed for that right now or not yet?
We are. We're looking at the scope of work, kind of laying out what the expected tasks would be. That will be brought forth to the bi-state working group, and then it would be a full procurement, very similar to what we did for the NEPA contract and would be doing for the engineering contract.
Thanks, Kevin.
All right. Well, Steve, thank you for holding on there. Let me go ahead and can you share the screen for your presentation?
There's a slight chance I'll be able to figure that out, yes.
There should be a green button down at the bottom.
No, I'll get it done. Okay.
That looks kind of like the administrative view. There should be a slideshow. I think if you look at the very top, 5 icons in, there's a little slideshow with a green arrow up at the very upper left-hand corner. There you go. Go five icons over at the very top. Looks like a little slideshow.
Yeah, there we go. Okay. I'm sorry, from the beginning. There we go. How's that? Better?
Well, that again is that looks like, let's see the display settings.
Is that,
That's the presenter's view.
Yeah, go up to that display settings, Steve.
swap, there we go. Better?
Bingo. Thank you.
So I lied when I said I could figure it out. I apologize. I'm sorry for, no matter how many times I do this, I screw it up. So thank you and good afternoon. Today begins the first of many dozens and dozens, I'm sure, discussions by this group on the finance plan. And just to be clear from the outset, we're not proposing in here a finance plan per se, but really just beginning to look at the elements of the finance plan and beginning to understand kind of the key factors and order of magnitude of what we're looking at. And so if, as we go through the show, start with essentially an executive summary, what's been analyzed, how it's been analyzed, and we get into the summary results. And then in the third part of the presentation, we'll get into the details on the financial plan analysis. And I think in some ways, that's really the key to today's discussion. This will be a somewhat deep dive into some of the financial plan factors and assumptions in order to give you a context so that as time goes on and we're dealing with more detailed questions, you have kind of an overall sense of how it fits into the financial model. And in addition to that, one of the issues that I think we will start addressing at the next meeting is the finance plan concepts become an important foundation for the legislation that we are going to be seeking hopefully next year in Oregon and Washington related to the governance, because that governance legislation needs to provide the proper authorities in order to make the financial plan itself work. And so as we go through what looks like some math, in fact, at some point, this gets translated into the statutory authorities related to governance. And then finally, at the end, we'll come back to the results after we've gone through the details, take a little more detailed look at the results in order to provide you an opportunity to ask questions about them again. But with that in mind, the first question that comes up is, what do we mean by a conceptual finance plan? Well, in short, I think what it's meant to imply is that a finance plan is only as good as the input data to it. And by that, I mean the construction cost, the construction schedule, the traffic and toll revenue forecasts. And each of those are at a very, very preliminary level. So that the numerical results that you will see are really don't have the inherent reliability and validity that they should have in order to be an actual finance plan. So when we look at the numerical results on this plan, we're really looking at orders of magnitude, relationships, but we're not actually looking at the specific numbers themselves, because they will change and they will all change. That said, I do think we are at a point where we can understand the financial issues because the data that we have is sufficient to understand that. The way the assessment goes, we're going to look at 3 different scenarios. They're all based on a $400 million capital cost. Again, I think we have by far the best capital cost for this project that we've had to date, but it's still very, very preliminary. And we'll get into some of the issues there that you need to take into consideration. But we'll use the $400 million for today's analysis. This analysis looks at the public model, not the P3 model. But the math behind the P3 model and the public model is very similar. The public model will presumably include some kind of equity contribution for which the P3 partner will want to get some return. That return on their investment is very similar to paying interest on a bond, at least in terms of how the model works. And so when we're looking at this model, even though it focuses on the public model, a P3 partner would be going through similar math in figuring out what they can offer. All 3 of the scenarios we look at are essentially the same, except for 2 changes. One is we're going to look at different levels of state and federal grants. And when we change the grant number, in return, we'll have to change the borrowing number. And the borrowings number consists of 2 components, a TIFIA component, which Kevin just kind of alluded to. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second, and a toll revenue component. But together, the 2 things that'll be varying are the grant amounts, the TIFIA amount, and the toll revenue amount. And in the end, we're going to be trying to estimate the toll rate required to meet the operating revenue requirements plus the debt service requirement for each scenario. So if you want to look at it this way, what we're really doing is saying at each level of grant, what does the toll rate have to be to make the numbers work? And so here's the 3 scenarios. These are in millions of dollars. They're in year of expenditure or inflated dollars, if you want. You could see the first 2 rows of revenue are the same in all scenarios. They include the build grant, and I made the assumption of getting $10 million, 5 from Oregon, 5 from Washington, in this 2021 session. The third line represents future grant amounts, and again, state grants, federal grants, any combination of all those. And we look at a total of $200 million in grants, $150 million in grants, and $100 million in grants. And in return, as the grant number goes down, the amount needed from toll revenue-based borrowings goes up. Now here I'm showing the toll revenue borrowing in 2 categories, TIFIA and toll revenue bonds. We'll get into that again in a little bit. But here you could kind of add the numbers together and see with a $200 million grant in scenario A, I need about $184 million in toll revenue borrowings. The grant number goes down by 50 million, the total in toll revenue borrowing go up by 50 million, and so on. So we will be looking at each of those scenarios and looking at what the toll rate needs to be to accomplish that level of toll revenue borrowing. And here is a little summary table, or a little summary chart of what that might look like. And we're looking at the toll rates for cars with a breeze by account. Obviously, the number would be different if you don't have a breeze by account, and the number will be different for trucks, and we'll look at that when we get to towards the end of the presentation. But one of the things you could see right away is I'll just start with the gray line starts with is the $200 million grant assumption, and it starts with a $2 toll in the year 2029, but that toll rate has to increase in order to meet the total operating cost and debt service obligation of the project. And the assumption that I built into this model is that we would increase the toll rate at roughly the CPI each year of 2%. And so you see that toll rate increasing at 2% over what's shown here as a 20-year period. Actually, that would go out probably another 10 or 15 years in the actual financial plan, probably about 30, 35 years. So when you look at a $2 toll, again, with a with a $200 million assumed grant, trying to fund the needed borrowing, starting with a $2 toll, that toll will go up to, I think, $2.75. Let me just check that out here. Yes. I'm sorry, it'll go up to about $3 by the year 2050. What you see in the other lines is as the grant amount goes down, so the gray line is a $200 million grant, the orange line is a $150 million grant, the blue line is a $100 million grant. What you see obviously is that the required toll rate goes up. And if you want to look at it in very rough terms, the difference between the $200 million grant toll and the $150 million grant toll is roughly 50 cents. I think it's 48 cents. And if you look at the required toll rate in the first year for a $100 million grant, you'll see that's pretty close to $3. So roughly is what we're looking at here. For each $50 million more of grant money, we save in the first year about 50 cents on the toll. And the way I kind of view it, just for my own sake, is if we assume a commuter, so two trips a day, 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year, just to make the math easy. What you'll see is that for each extra $50 million in grant money that we get, we're saving that toll payer about $100 a year in 2029, and that number will go up. So actually, if you look out here, the difference between the $200 million grant line and the $150 million grant line is about 50 cents on the toll. in the year 2050, it's about 75 cents, right? Because you're escalating a larger number. And so, the equation essentially becomes, how much grant money can we get, and in return, what the toll rate has to be, and then of course, with an attempt to keep that toll rate at some reasonable level that would be politically acceptable. So maybe I'll just stop there for a second. Before I get into the details of how this was all calculated, and just make sure that everybody at least followed kind of the concept of what the analysis does.
Steve, this is Arthur Babbitt. So if I could just ask you, what assumptions were you making concerning the toll revenue, the total traffic? Are these conservative assumptions, or are they middle of the road assumptions?
Well, yes, I would say in general, these are middle of the road assumptions, right? You can make optimistic, you can make pessimistic. This is kind of in the middle, with perhaps a slight tinge to the conservative side. So if 0 is totally optimistic and 10 is totally pessimistic, I'd probably say the assumptions in general will be in the 6.5 range. With regard to the traffic and toll revenue themselves, and I'll get into this in a second, a year or so ago, Stantec, under a contract with the Port Hood River, did a conceptual toll revenue estimate. And I've actually tried to match up their forecast with this analysis. So we're using an estimate prepared by Stantec. It was, again, like everything else, it's very preliminary, subject to change. But actually, in terms of toll revenue and traffic and toll revenue, out of all the things, all the inputs that'll get forecasted into the financial model, that's probably the most reliable. And the reason it's the most reliable is we have a bridge, we know what the numbers are. There will be some diversion as the toll rate gets higher, and I'll define diversion in a second. But there'll be some diversion as the toll rate gets higher. But Stantec did not believe it would be very substantial. The term diversion, which gets confusing a little bit, essentially means a trip that would have come across the bridge that doesn't anymore for any reason. And that reason could be that they went to a different bridge, or they just don't take the trip at all, or they consolidate trips in some ways. When we looked into this issue in great detail on the I-5 Interstate Bridge project, a good deal, and there, of course, there's a bridge on I-205 that isn't all that far away from the I-5 bridge. So there was some bridge diversion. But when it came to just trips that weren't made, a lot of those trips were commercial trips by trucks or businesses that were on a free bridge, might have been going back and forth the bridge 2 or 3 times in a day. And instead, with a toll, they'd probably just consolidate all those trips into one in order to avoid the cost. So anyway, bottom line is that the traffic and toll revenue numbers used here are probably pretty reasonable and based on work done by Stantec. And I should mention in the traffic and toll revenue forecasting world, the two largest and arguably most esteemed traffic and toll revenue forecasting firms are Stantec's one of the top two. And so it's a top level national, international firm. So now I'm going to get into a little deeper dive on the details of the financial plan forecast, assumptions, and so on. Feel free to interrupt with questions whenever you wish. But let's start by understanding that during the course of any project like this, there'll be dozens and dozens of financial plans produced as different assumptions change, or as financial plans are produced for different purposes. For me, the way I try to view it is if the financial plan is not final in any way until you get to what I kind of call here the investment grade financial plan. And I don't know that there's an actual word investment grade financial plan, but I'm using that term to mean that that's the financial plan that we'll use to submit to the credit rating agencies, for the TIFIA loan, to the toll bond underwriters and whatnot. And that plan is a minimum of 2 years away and maybe 3. So that's a way out. We are at the very, very beginning of this process. And I think you need to kind of keep that in mind. So, you know, if I say the toll is $2, it may or may not be $2 by the time we get, 2 or 3 years into this. And we will keep on monitoring that and bringing you updates as assumptions change. But to get to the investment grade, we will need a few things. One of which, this new entity, bi-state entity that will be the borrower, will have to be up and running. And one of the questions that had come up a year ago is, well, isn't that going to be a problem to have a new entity that really has no performance history? Will that be a problem in getting the proper credit ratings and whatnot? And that was the focus. Kevin mentioned a few minutes ago that Michael and I had a conversation with quite a few staff members from the U.S. Department of Transportation's TIFIA office. And it was on that question. Essentially, the question I posed to them was, we are creating this new entity. What can we do, given the fact that it's going to be a new entity, in order to enhance our ability to show credit worthiness to the TIFIA office? And their response was interesting and helpful. What was interesting about it was that they said, look, this happens before. We're not the first one to run into this issue. And as long as the independent bi-state entity is provided the necessary and sufficient authority to do the borrowing, the fact that it's a new entity shouldn't be an overwhelming problem. It will be something we will need to address, but it's not something that they thought would get in the way. Instead, what they said was, it's really going to be the math of the borrowing. It's going to be showing sufficient coverage, sufficient reserves, sufficient reliability on the traffic and toll revenue forecast. That's going to be the key to getting a sufficient credit rating. And the one thing we have going for us, which is a really big deal, and the TIFIA office highlighted this, is the fact that that we have a toll bridge. So that forecast is not an out of the sky a modeled number. There is actual real world documented evidence of what that expected traffic and toll revenue ought to be. And so they thought the fact that that the Port Hood River manages the current bridge and would be involved in this new entity in some way would be of great importance in terms of facilitating a positive credit rating. So,
Steve, I have a question.
sure.
A couple questions on that last little part that you just talked about. So you said that when you ask about, the credit worthiness and, it's a new entity, and then you said something to the effect of that the group that's put together needs to have the authority. Now, so the authority granted to them from their specific governing bodies to
No.
obligate?
No, the authority that I was talking about, and you will begin to see more specifically what I'm talking about here beginning next month, is so we're going to go to hopefully to the state of Oregon and Washington and seek approval of a compact. And that compact will be 15 pages long and will be defining the authority of this new bi-state entity. It will say what they can do. And so this would be like a special district. This bi-state entity, this new governing body, will only have the authority that's granted to it by the legislatures of Oregon and Washington. And so what the TIFIA office is saying is make sure when you write that legislation that you're quite clear about the fact that they can borrow, what types of bonds, are there any limitations on amounts, what can they spend the money on, how do toll rates get set, all those kind of questions need to be very explicit, very clear in this legislation. And that's the authority they're talking about. And so when you begin to see what I've been working on, you will see that that's there. So it'll say this new bi-state entity can borrow whatever amounts from loans, toll revenue bonds, short-term bonds, so on and so forth, in whatever amounts they need in order to construct the project.
So two more questions. So I thank you for explaining that. That makes it more clear. So if you have a brand new entity, how do you get a credit rating when you are a brand new entity that's never been in existence prior?
Well, because the credit rating will be based on the math of the bonds themselves. And we're going to go through that here in a little bit.
Okay.
But
And then-
let me just, when I say the math, in the end, the lender just wants to know that it's going to get repaid. Right? I mean, it's just that simple. And so what you'll see in the financial model is we'll put in reserves, we'll put in coverage, we'll put in other factors that will give the lender the comfort that the money will be there. I'm sorry, Mayor McBride, you had another question?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, the only other question I had that was kind of alluded to is that because the port has done this before, and they, they have a tolling system and have, run a bridge, that they would have they would be more comfortable because the port has already done this, except that this won't be the port. It'll be a bi-state working group.
Yeah, but I think it's really the issue that the bridge exists and there's a long history of the amount of traffic and the amount of traffic growth on the existing bridge.
Oh, okay. So that's
So-
what that has to do with.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Like, because the absolute worst problems that have occurred in the toll bonding world over the past 20 years in the US anyway, have been those toll projects that have gone, they call them, greenfield projects. It's a toll road and where there wasn't one before. And some of those have been way off in terms of their fork, way off in terms, went bankrupt. And so the assurance that there's the Port River has been operating this bridge for 70 years. So we have a 70-year history of what those numbers are. And I think that's really important. It will be really important to the credit rating. One of the things I wanted to point out, start talking about, is the construction costs. Now, I prepared a memo, although I didn't prepare most of the numbers in the memo, that came up with a high and a low cost estimate a couple of months ago. WSP had prepared a cost estimate for the final design and construction, which is 3/4 of the total cost. The rest of it is project development work, like doing the financial work and that kind of thing. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about those construction costs. One is to remind you what they are, but two is also to tell you why you should not focus on these numbers a lot quite yet. So when we looked at the current cost estimate, the low end was about $330 million, of which about 240 was the actual design and construction in current dollars. About 23 million was the rest of the project development work. And we had about $70 million in inflation. High end, you could see, gets up to 400 million, and that includes about $80 million in inflation. And I'm for today's presentation, I'm using the $400 million number. But I want to talk a little bit about that. So here I somewhat use the euphemism future refinements to the capital cost, which is maybe a kinder and gentler way of saying, here's some things that I would consider risks in the current forecast. And one of them, actually listed at number 2, is that we need to do substantially more geotechnical investigation in order to make sure that the foundational costs are accurate. And that's part of the engineering work that'll be done in the next phase. But the other one, and the one that's a little scarier to me in some respects, is that we don't have at this moment an actual construction schedule, or more importantly for me anyway, a cash flow of construction expenditures. And that too will be something that will be developed during the next phase. But I want to point out one key aspect of that, and that deals with the fact that the construction can only occur during in-water work windows, which are an outcome, if you will, from the from the NEPA work that Kevin's been leading. And so as part of that, there will be a series of work windows for in-water work and construction that requires to be in the water, which is a lot of it, can only occur in those windows. And that really creates a problem for construction schedule. And in looking into this issue a little bit, we had a meeting, we being Kevin, Michael, and myself, with a friend of mine, actually, but somebody I worked for, who was the deputy project manager on the construction of the Tillicum Crossing Bridge across the Willamette here in Portland. And they ran into the same problem that we are going to run into here, which is that if you don't do anything extraordinary, because of the narrowness of these construction windows, it will take a long time to construct the bridge. Right, and if it takes a long time to construct the bridge, there's more escalation. And to Senator King's point, with supply chains being what they are, the longer it takes, the more escalation there is. In a higher escalation environment, these numbers the total costs can get higher. And this is, I want to point that out as one of the risks, if you will, inherent in the numbers that we're using. What we assume in these numbers is that the project would be able to obtain as many barges as it required and as many construction cranes to put on those barges as required in order to get the bridge done in 3 years, the new bridge constructed in 3 years. That does not include the demolition of the old bridge, which will take another 3 years. And what the cost number assumes is that we would pay a premium for that extra marine work. And there's a premium assumed in these numbers. But whether we can actually get enough barges, whether that's a reasonable assumption to assume to get enough barges to complete the work in 3 years, needs to be tested. And that becomes one of the key issues for the next phase of engineering. The reason I emphasize this is when I'm showing you a finance plan for a $400 million construction project, built into that is this risk. And so just keep that in mind. And that's why I keep trying to emphasize the concepts and relationships of what I am showing are probably more important than the actual numerical results that I'm showing today.
Hey, Steve, just a time check. We're about 2:52, 8 minutes away from 3. And I know you've got a few more slides. And
all right, let me skip. I'll skip a little bit just to try to make it through. Borrowings, again, like I was saying before, we're looking at a TIFIA loan and we're looking at toll revenue bonds. You will hear the word TIFIA quite a bit because the terms of that loan are very, very good. Today, on a 35-year TIFIA loan, we would pay 2.35%, 2.35% interest on a 35-year loan. And TIFIA is subordinate to the toll revenue bonds, meaning the toll revenue bonds get repaid before the TIFIA gets repaid in the funding scheme. And so a lot of what we're doing is trying to aim the project to be a good candidate for a TIFIA loan. Some other concepts that are going to come into play, debt service coverage. So this is what we were talking about before. One of the assurances, one of the ways to give assurances to lender is to say, if we need $10 million to pay off a loan, we will make sure we have $15 million. So that $15 million divided by 10 or 1.5 would be a debt service coverage ratio. And one of the things anybody with a total revenue bonds would have to do would be to have a decent debt service coverage ratio. And given the fact that this entity, this new borrowing entity, will have no revenue other than the revenue it gets from tolls and related fees, we're going to have to make sure that that debt service coverage ratio is adequate. And then in addition to that, we provide for a number of reserves, some of which will be required by the lender, and some of which will just be good management practices that this new bi-state entity would require. But the lender will require a debt service reserve. There is a somewhat standard formula that gets used. I picked the easiest part of that formula here, so that which is 10% of the loan amount. So in other words, if you take out $200 million in loans, you'll have to have a $20 million debt service reserve. The other thing just to be cognizant of is that a lot of the borrowing will begin before toll revenues are being collected, and interest will be accruing and perhaps even owed, depending on how you set up those bonds, during the construction period prior to tolling the new bridge. And what that'll be reflected as is capitalized interest. In other words, we would build into the borrowing an amount of money to pay off the interest that has to be paid during the construction period. So when you actually going back to the scenarios and remembering that say for scenario A, I needed 185 million, give or take, in toll revenue bonds and TIFIA loans to get to my $400 million number. What you're going to see is that the borrowing is going to be actually substantially greater than that 184 million, because I have to account for the debt reserves. Will probably be required by the lender to have an operating reserve. And then on top of that, there'll be some capitalized interest that'll have to be paid. So that $184 million loan actually becomes, another $35 million higher. If you go to the far end and you look at the scenario C, so remember, scenario C is less grant money, more borrowing. What you see is that on top of the actual amount of borrowings that go into the project, there's another 55 million in reserves and other costs that have to be repaid out of that borrowing. So when you start looking at these numbers, there's a lot of times there's a sense that, well, if things double, the toll rate doubles. Well, if things double, the toll rate more than doubles, because you have all of these additional kind of multiplicative factors that are in the financing itself. This chart looks at for the I guess I didn't put it here, but this would be for the $200 million grant. And it's looking at between 2030 and 2050, so the first 20 years, if you will, of toll collections. You see the blue part shows you the percent of that goes into operations and maintenance. The bigger number, the orange part, is the debt service. And the gray area up here is the coverage and the surplus that goes beyond the operating maintenance and debt service reserve. And so what we are trying to do is to come up with a toll rate and changes in that toll rate that produce the total amount needed year by year for each of these scenarios. This is the same chart I showed you at the beginning. This is for the cars with breeze-by accounts, and this gray line here is what the toll rate would have to be in order to achieve this on this level of operating maintenance, debt service, and reserves and coverage year by year. This chart here just shows the same thing I just showed for cars. This is showing for the average truck. The average truck is roughly, since I'm assuming toll rates based on number of axles. Again, when in the next phase of toll revenue analysis, whether it's Stantec or another firm, they will go through a number of policy choices about how to set up toll rates. And we will need to make certain conclusions about those, at least for the time being, in order to have the set of assumptions to plug into the financial model. And one of them might be, we will base it on a number of axles, and based on number of axles, you can see the chart looks similar to that for cars, except instead of a $2 toll, we start at a $9 toll for the $200 million grant scenario. And that number is closer to $13.50 if we only get a $100 million grant. Obviously, interest rates matter. I won't go through this given the time period in too much detail, but I will tell you that what I did here was I really have two interest rates, one for TIFIA and one for the toll revenue bonds. And this rate is the average of the two. So on the gray scenario here, that's assuming a 3.5% TIFIA rate and a 5.5% toll revenue rate. So the average is 4.5%, which was kind of my base scenario for this analysis. That gets the $2 toll. What you see is for every 0.5%, that average interest rate either goes down or goes up. It increases or decreases the toll rate by about 20 cents. So again, to put that into perspective, that'd be about 40 cents a day for a commuter, $2 a week, about $100 a year. So for every 0.5%, the interest rate goes up, $100 a year. For every, again, rounding these numbers off quite a bit, but in every 0.5% down, it saves the toll rate pay $100 a year if it's a daily commuter. And I think with that, I'll just stop and open it up for questions.
Steve, what amortization term did you use?
Well, for the TIFIA alone, it was 35 years. And what I did, what the TIFIA office would call sculpting. In other words, since the toll rate is increasing every year on the assumptions I made, the amount of toll revenue increases every year. And I sculpted the debt service to match that toll revenue. I did the same thing on the toll bonds. Those had a term of 30 years and obviously a higher interest rate. The coverage, I assumed a 2 times coverage on the senior toll bonds, which is great, but that didn't really constrain anything. And I assumed that the total coverage, when I added the TIFIA and the toll revenues together, was 1.25, which is a good, reasonable number. Whether we will need to make it higher because we're a new entity or not remains to be seen. But the 1.25 would be a reasonable assumption to make today.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Steve? Steve, thank you. Appreciate. Now, what do you want to give a preview of what you would like to present at the next meeting?
Quickly, I think that the next 2 meetings are probably several thereafter. We're going to start getting into the compact, the legislation for this new entity. You will see why I wanted to focus a little bit on the financing, because you will begin to see elements in the proposed powers of this new authority that relate back to those financing principles. I think for the next session, I'd like to go through a number of the key issues about the powers of the compact and how I address them in general terms. And I think shortly following the next meeting, we will distribute an initial draft of the legislation itself, and we'll begin to go through that in July. I'm assuming that whatever that legislation looks like at the beginning, it will undoubtedly look a lot different by the time we go through everything. We're hoping, well, in Washington, we know we're going to be working with the Joint Transportation Committee, and they're going to hire a private legal firm to help review it. We'll be working with the DOJs in both states, hope to be working with the general counsel, city council, county councils of each of your jurisdictions, having them review it as well. And so we begin that next month with really trying to just identify the major issues and talk about them in general before diving into the actual wording itself.
Great, thank you. All right, let's see here. One thing that I wanted to get into, and that was the strategy principles. I don't believe we'll have a huge discussion on this. Christy, are you still with us?
Yeah, I am. I'm driving, so that's why my camera's off.
Okay. I know you and Marla talked through this. Did everybody, members of the working group, has everybody had a chance to review this?
I have not. I'm sorry. I just got it earlier today.
I read through it.
Christy, do you want to just maybe just talk in general about your conversation with Mayor Kiefler?
Sure, no problem. Yeah, we had a discussion, and I think that there was maybe a miscommunication or a slight misunderstanding. Correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin. And in talking through this document, we were able to basically come to an understanding of what the purpose of this document is, and agree on this format, basically. Is that it in a nutshell, Kevin?
Yeah, I think this is a helpful document for staff and the project and those that will be investing in our project, certainly from a political perspective, that by having this strategy on board just helps show that we've got a comprehensive document that we can certainly follow as we move forward. Part of it was, to what degree do we focus on the project delivery options, keeping in mind that we want to ultimately deliver the best project using the most efficient means available to us. And so I feel that between Christy and Mayor Keithler, unfortunately, she's not able to attend. I feel that this is a good compromise. If there's any other feedback, I'd certainly like to take this and be able to publicize it as a document that staff and that we can use when we're advocating for continued funding, and also be able to take it back to the Port Commission for port approval, because that's important from the port's perspective.
I like this a lot. It's a little bit more plain language than the port's first draft, but it feels more in a collaborative manner than some of the suggestions that we had last time. It just explains it better somehow. I definitely like this draft better than anything I've seen so far.
I like it as well. I like the language is, well crafted.
Great, and thank you, Christy, and certainly for Marla as well for taking the time to work through that with us.
It was really mostly Marla, but I tried to help too. But yes, I obviously agree with, I like it a lot.
Thank you anyway, Christy. It looks like good, solid work.
Great, thank you. And then I know we're past time, but is there general agreement that we should just go ahead and try to find a monthly date that works for everyone? Okay, what I'll do is I'll send a series of emails out and see if we can't pin down a day so we can spend more of our time moving forward with the bridge replacement and less on setting up meetings. Let's see, any closing comments or thoughts or?
Kevin, if I could,
Yeah.
Sorry about that. I had an interview in the last 20 minutes or so. I was just looking back in. Did the working group endorse or approve or vote on this strategy?
I said we don't really have voting. Our MOU is consensus based, but I sensed that there was support for this amended version of the strategy.
Okay, and that comes from each of the standing members of the group. Well,
Yes.
Mayor Keithler isn't here, but she was part of the crafting here at the end. Okay, so there's a consensus approval of this, these strategic principles.
Yeah, that was my takeaway.
Okay.
I think we heard from everybody but Commissioner Anderson.
Yeah, is Jake still? Jake, are you still on board?
Yep, I'm still here, guys.
Okay, and you're fine with the you're on board with the principles?
Yes, sir.
Awesome. All right, everybody. Any other thoughts? Okay, hearing none. Thank you, everybody, and I'll be in touch shortly. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin.
Bye-bye.